Welcome to The Explainer. Brazil is the country of the future. It's a phrase people have literally been repeating for over a century now. You hear it in economic forecasts, you see it in those absolutely stunning postcard images of Rio de Janeiro, and you really feel it when you look at the sheer massive scale of the nation. Yet somehow, despite all of that incredible promise, the future just never seems to actually arrive. Well, today we are going to peel back those beautiful postcard images and take a hard look at the cold macroeconomic logic that has kept this sleeping giant from finally waking up. So we really have to start by asking a central paradox. Why is the future never arriving? How does a nation with more natural resources and fertile land than almost anyone else on the planet remain trapped in this frustrating cycle of poverty? They are constantly just almost making it to superpower status. It's a genuine macroeconomic mystery. And to put that in perspective, consider this almost unbelievable contrast. On one side, we have Brazil sitting on just massive natural wealth, but really struggling to break through. On the flip side, we have South Korea and Japan. Just a few decades ago, these two nations were starting from absolute ruins. I mean, they have virtually no natural resources to speak of. Yet they rapidly bypassed the resource-rich giant of South America to become undisputed global economic powerhouses. Why on earth did resource-poor nations succeed, where a resource-rich nation completely stalled? To solve this mystery today, we'll examine 4 specific pillars keeping this giant asleep. First, the primary good trap. Second, shielded competition. Third, the human capital gap. And finally, fearful elites. Let's dive right in.
Starting with number 1, the primary good trap.
So what exactly is a primary good trap? Basically, it occurs when an economy relies almost entirely on unprocessed raw materials. We're talking commodities like coffee, sugar, beef, and iron ore. The problem here is that if you only sell these primary goods, you are entirely at the mercy of foreign nations. You're exporting raw materials on the cheap, and then overseas markets take those exact same materials, turn them into highly engineered, expensive manufactured goods, and sell them right back to you for a massive premium. You're doing all the heavy lifting, but they are capturing all the real wealth. Which brings us to a frankly shocking piece of history: 60 million. Back during the Great Depression, the global market for raw commodities absolutely collapsed. Brazil was so desperate to keep the price of coffee from crashing entirely that they literally burned 60 million bags of it. To put that into perspective, that was roughly 2 whole years' worth of the entire world's coffee consumption at the time. Just destroyed. Gone. In a desperate attempt to manipulate the market and stay afloat. Historically, this massive crisis actually forced a pivot. In 1929, the Great Depression causes this huge coffee crisis. By the early 1930s, Brazil wakes up and realizes the absolute danger of the raw material trap. They see they cannot just rely on growing things and crossing their fingers anymore. So by the late 1930s, they take action. They start building their own domestic clothing and chemical factories to try and break this cycle once and for all. Their solution was a pretty bold strategy known as import substitution. And the logic is super simple. If you can't buy manufactured goods fairly on the global market because you're stuck selling cheap coffee, well, you just make them yourself. It was a completely understandable attempt to industrialize. But while their intention was dead right, the way they actually executed this strategy set them up for their next major macroeconomic failure. And that brings us to pillar number 2, shielded from competition. Think back to the South Korean miracle for a second. The South Korean government actively supported massive domestic companies, those big chaebols like Samsung or Hyundai. But here is the absolute key distinction. They forced those companies to compete on the unforgiving world stage. It was sink or swim globally. In stark contrast, Brazil's government chose to protect its newly formed domestic businesses from any foreign competition using incredibly high taxes and tariffs. They essentially built an impenetrable wall around their own industries. And when you build that wall, the economic costs are devastating. Without competition, a business simply stops innovating. It becomes highly inefficient, it produces low-quality goods, and because the folks at home have literally no other choice, it charges incredibly high prices for subpar products. We have seen this exact same economic failure historically in places like India before the 1990s and the Soviet Union. Protectionism breeds complacency, and complacency absolutely kills economic growth. Moving on to pillar number 3, the human capital gap. There is a cold, hard macroeconomic truth at play here. An engineering degree creates far more economic value than manual labor. It's just a fact. If you want a high-tech, advanced economy, like we see with the Nordic model or over in Japan, you absolutely need a highly skilled workforce.
The Nordic model thrives because their governments invest heavily in broad, high-quality education for everyone. They understand that to move past just digging things out of the ground, you need a population capable of engineering, coding, and designing the future.
But in Brazil, we see a stark and historic education divide. Honestly, very much like what was seen in colonial-era Africa. You had the elites who were extremely well-educated and held all the political power. And then you had the vast majority of the population, who were historically left behind with very few skills to actually navigate or contribute to a modern high-tech industrial economy. You simply cannot build a 21st century powerhouse when the majority of your population is locked out of the necessary education to compete globally. And that leads us to our final roadblock, number 4, fearful elites. For centuries, Brazil's political power was monopolized by a very small group of land-owning aristocrats. There is a totally fascinating historical parallel here to the Hungarian elites in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, because both of these ruling classes shared a very specific, very deep fear. They were absolutely terrified of broad industrialization. So why were they so afraid? Well, because industrialization inevitably creates a wealthy, educated middle class, and a middle class inevitably demands more rights, better representation, and political freedom. For Brazil's landowning aristocrats, it was simply much easier and much safer for their own social status to keep the system totally rigged for basic resource extraction. Building a modern, diversified economy that benefited everyone meant risking their absolute grip on political power. Let's bring this all together with our final verdict: policy over soil. If you take one thing away from this explainer today, let it be this: wealth isn't about what's in your soil, but what's in your policy. Listen, Brazil is not cursed. It is not doomed by geography. In fact, it has the resources, the people, and the raw potential to be exactly what everyone says it is. The problem isn't the land. The problem is that they have been operating under the wrong macroeconomic rules for decades. So how does the future finally arrive? It requires some very specific structural steps. Step 1. Brazil must definitively pivot away from that 19th century primary good logic. They just have to stop relying solely on the harvest. And step 2, they must adopt the high-skill, globally competitive miracle models of the 21st century. That means investing heavily in broad human capital and forcing domestic industries to compete and innovate on the world stage rather than shielding them behind big tariffs. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question. Is it truly possible for a country so unbelievably rich in raw resources to ever fully escape the primary good trap? Or, because the temptation of easy commodity money is just too strong, are they destined to simply remain a gas station and a giant farm for the rest of the industrialized world? It is a truly fascinating debate about the destiny of nations. I want to hear your thoughts on this. Can policy actually overcome the temptation of the soil? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.